Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Wednesday, May 1st. May Day. May 1st, 2024. May Day, May Day, May Day, as a matter of fact. Noted in the morning post, whenever you say May Day, you have to say it 3 times. I learned that from the movies. No one will take you seriously if you say, May Day, May Day, the ship is sinking, the plane is going down. You only said it twice. That can't be right. And, of course, when you dispatch a rescue group and you're in a big hurry and you got to get them on that helicopter, if you just say go, go, no one will go. But if you say go, 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 that always works. So go, 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 Mayday, 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 and move, 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 that too. Same thing. Gotta say it 3 times, magic words to get the show started. Plenty to round up today. Yet more changes and evolution and chaos, I suppose, surrounding the various protests around the country, but also chaos about the chaos. That is to say, 1, not all chaos is the same. 2, not all chaos is actually chaos. And 3, you don't always have to have chaos even if the opportunity presents itself. So, lots happening in New York City. New York City? Yes. New York City at Columbia, and at the other campuses in the city that had similar pro-Palestinian encampments. I don't know, what do we call them? I mean, there was some controversy about whether or not to call them encampments, but I don't think we're gonna go along with that one. That one was stupid. But well, all right. At any rate, the point is that the campuses in New York, the administrations have moved to clear out these the encampments and also to end the building occupation that began yesterday at Columbia. Whereas at other encampments around the country, in some cases, there have been more peaceful settlements, agreements between administration and protesting students, for instance, at Brown University. But I guess everything's subject to change because yesterday I think we mentioned, oh, well, they're doing much better out at UCLA than they have been with the protests in East Coast schools for the most part. And then UCLA fell apart as well. So, let's see, they started to crack down on their protesters there. And then overnight, I guess the big story besides the New York City sweep through the various protests is that, I guess what's being reported by the student newspaper there, the Daily Bruin, as pro-Israeli counter-demonstrators. It's not entirely clear if they're all students themselves. Who knows? There may even be outside agitators involved in all of this. That, of course, a favorite fallback position for administrators of all types everywhere, whether on university campuses or mayors of cities or what have you. But at any rate, clashes overnight at the encampment at UCLA, including counter-protesters coming and throwing things into the encampment. The encampments now are encircling themselves with barriers of various kinds, and so throwing things over the top and into where there are people, including dangerous objects. Pepper spray has come out, fireworks being fired off, and just plain punches being thrown. And, it's not a great situation. Certainly not at UCLA. This sounds really annoying and antagonistic and dangerous in many cases. And, of course, to sort of be the cherry on top of things is that whereas in many campuses around the country, the cops are being called in and are rather brutal in dragging people away, beating them sometimes, sitting on top of them, pepper spraying them, all the usual things you see whenever armed cops are sent against largely unarmed protesters. But in addition to all of that, where are we going with this one? I don't even. All right. Well, at any rate, the cops. Oh yes, right. When it devolved into things being thrown into fireworks being fired into the encampment, the cops suddenly kind of fall silent and don't have anything to. We're not sure what to do here. We're very confused. We'll just stand idly by. as the people inside the encampment call out for assistance from police. It's all quite sad. A few bright spots, as I mentioned, at Brown University. They managed to get the students to agree to dissolve their encampment, but in exchange for this was their decision, in exchange for the promise that the administration will meet later, at some later date, to consider their various demands with regard to divestment. And, a lot of people happily pointing to Brown University and saying, why can't we all do it more like this? But yesterday we were all saying that I think it looks like they might get that way. They might get to that solution at UCLA, and then they didn't. So it's a wait and see kind of a game. And of course, I have to remind you, there shouldn't really be anything shocking about finding out that different groups of people, even similarly minded groups of people, but different actual groups of individuals in different locations dealing with different situations under different circumstances and bargaining with different partners, sometimes over slightly different demands, will occasionally reach different conclusions. We can't just simply, I guess in the middle of the protest for freedom and individual rights, etc., I guess try showing up at another campus and telling them, well, they settled at Brown, so all of you have to leave. They're not going to agree to that. Things will be different from one place to another. And by the way, talk about your wait and see game. Wait and see. When in a couple of months, the Brown administration, should they meet and decide not to meet the protesters' demands, there may be an encampment again. This could go on for quite some time. But in the meantime, what can I tell you? All we can do is appeal for calm and nonviolence and hope that cooler heads prevail. It's just that in many cities, we hire people who are opposed to cooling their heads, and then we give them batons, and I don't know. Things happen. Anyway, Greg Dworkin is here with his own roundup of those stories and more, because there's a former guy on trial in the middle of all of this, though not today. Today he has his day off, so he can go to Westchester and play golf. Good morning, Greg. How are you?
Good morning. The trial is still the big news.
Good.
Sure.
We'll
the
pay
current
attention
news
to that one.
is the campus protests.
Yes.
And I'll have a word or two to say about that.
It is Wednesday.
But I am reminded of a conservative, Edward Luce, in the Conservative Financial Times, writing a very nice piece, actually, saying, look, the problem isn't the kids at the universities, it's the grown-ups. Well, the grown-ups are the ones who really can't handle the truth.
Yes.
The grown-ups are the ones that are calling in the police. The grown-ups are the ones in Columbia who aren't following university process. They didn't consult with the Senate before calling in the police. And the police are the ones who are saying, oh, this is outside agitators, and we have proof, even though the
I don't know if they do have that
student radio network, WKCR, which is excellent, as pointed out.
Yeah, they did a remarkable job.
Nearly 100% are students. So, again, we made the distinction between off-campus and on-campus. This is on-campus stuff. On the other hand, there is no question that windows were smashed.
True.
And property was destroyed in order to obtain access to Hamilton Hall. Once in, they barricaded it. Once you do that, you're going to get arrested.
Yes, that is.
It's going to happen.
And they expect it as well.
So the idea that, we'll just look the other way, that's not happening either.
No. And then, of course, there's a second round of recriminations. Well, the cops smashed even more on their way. Yep. They did.
Well, they did, because
you're not supposed to be there also.
The place with it, and they needed to get to you. So what do you think was going to happen? And,
you can't
let me just
really
tell you
hold
the
those
politics of it. The politics of it is, as the protesters were loaded on police buses and taken off to the tombs or wherever they go, or booking, book them, Dano.
Central booking.
Central.
Maybe. I don't know.
New York City street people were cheering.
New York City, what? Street people?
Yeah, the people on the street.
Oh, just regular. Oh,
buses.
I thought you meant you're talking about the unhoused.
Are not popular.
Ubiquitous. That's an interesting point. It's a good point because, in the progressive spaces, of course, we're talking about the protests because it's interesting and the developments are interesting. But even on these campuses, they're not all that super popular. And as a matter of fact,
I'll give you an example. And I think, my son pointed this out to me.
If we get to the same one.
Here is a typical
I'll give you
Columbia student reaction.
All right.
I am totally sympathetic to the idea that Netanyahu sucks, Likud sucks, the Israeli government sucks, They shouldn't be starving people in Gaza, but I got to get to class, and these people are really annoying.
That is, I think, prevailing sentiment. And, but that's always the way it is.
You didn't need the protest to get that guy to feel that way.
That's true. But, you did. Well, you needed to protest in order to elicit that comment. So they got the comment, and they got all the people who suck on the record. Also, one other counterexample I will point out. This one really kind of surprised me, and I'm curious how they're going to deal with this. But it's the end of the school year. They're preparing, of course, looking ahead to the beginning of the next school year. The Columbia student body has just elected the new student government for next year and elected as president of the student body, assembly, senate, I don't know, an Israeli student in the middle of all of this. So that'll have some repercussions among the protesting crowd who will, I assume, consider the president of the student body now to be illegitimate. But I mean, the student body voted. I don't think anybody's alleging any fraud about that, right?
Well, so there's the Columbia piece. Then there's the LA piece, UCLA.
Yes.
And in that case, and I use the term advisedly because this is not who they were, but this is how they were acting. It's as if 200 West Bank settlers showed up and started attacking the protest camp.
I mean, that's a good parallel.
Completely different than what happened on the East Coast. And
there's a geographic separation.
They were separated by the cops who were doing their job there, although, it's one of those, I saw them attack the camp, and they didn't do anything. Well, it's like J6, where, if you have a mob of a couple of thousand people and 20 cops, you're not going to do anything.
Right. And then, of course, yesterday no one would have complained about it being 20.
But then reinforcements were brought in. Now, what happens after that? The protesters are blamed for the violence, but the violence was outside agitators without question. It's very different.
Certainly outside to the protests, were they from, you mean off-campus non-students? Is that
off-campus non-students.
Well, that also sucks. And lots of people.
And they have pictures they're all like in their 40s.
Okay. Well, that's not great. And somebody did point
had
out
a political cartoon, which was very funny.
We'll
not
see.
funny. So you could see the college behind walls, but the gate is open. And peering in, you can see a tent city. Mm-hmm. And a homeless guy is sitting with his back against the wall, with a cup, help.
Okay. And
his comment is, when you're done with the tents, can I have them?
I get you.
And,
Yeah.
Whether you're for the People's Front of Judea or the Judean People's Front, the protests are not working the way the organizers think they are. That's all I'm saying here.
Although what else are they going to do?
I'm a practical person. How is it playing out? Not well.
There's a big mix of reactions.
Are you convincing people to do what you need to do? You brought up Brown. Let me give you some complications about the Brown approach.
Sure. I imagine there are many.
There are many. And you'd wish more finance and business people would be part of these protests because I think they understand. But, of course, if you look at who they are, they're not going to be part of the protest as much as others.
Well, you're not going to ruin a suit.
Yeah, exactly. So let's say you want to divest.
I want to divest.
Okay. How do you do that? Now, what if Brown,
E-trade,
for example,
is
invested in a mutual fund?
I don't know.
How much control do you, as the investor in the mutual fund, have on who the mutual fund buys stock from?
Very little.
Or invests in companies?
Maybe none. Zero?
Maybe none. So there's a lot of situations like that where you can say, well, I want you to divest. What does that mean?
Right.
Most of the time, the universities are not directly investing in Israeli companies. But what if you invest in something like Pepsi?
Yes. Well,
which has bought an Israeli company.
That is true. Like if you're, it's one thing to be invested in SodaStream.
Right, and if you get mad because I say it is complicated.
It is.
So simply divesting isn't simple. So it's an unreasonable demand that can't be met, along with, and also I want a ceasefire because
Yes, I'll get you one. Hold on.
Because the university is responsible for negotiating a ceasefire. So we're protesting at the university. Like, what are you doing? What is your goal? How is this practically going to happen? Lay it out. And if you can't, what are you doing?
Did they do this better at Brown?
I don't know. I guess so. Or maybe the college administration at Brown is a lot more reasonable, because usually when things really go south, it's because administration screwed up, not the students. Students are going to protest. That's what they do. I get that. It's okay.
True. Yeah, I mean, I guess at some point,
it's up to administration to say to the students, we'd like to, but in this particular situation, let me lay out how complicated it is, and that's why we can't just accede to your demand.
It might be an idea, right, to say, well, here's a great opportunity to teach something.
Isn't that what universities
wouldn't you
are
like
for?
to? Yeah, shall we discuss this? And of course, there will be people who, and I guess it depends on who the student leadership is there too. In some cases, there will be people who say, I get it. Let's keep working towards something that's doable. And then there will also be student leaders on other campuses say, no, it's a trap. And we must refuse everything.
So I'm not blaming the students. And I'm not necessarily saying what the students are doing is stupid. Maybe not. But one can step back and critique whether or not what the students are doing is effective.
Yes.
And if you're going to smash windows to break into a hall to occupy it and then get upset because the police come, sorry.
Well, no. And even there, I don't think that anybody who was occupying the building had any, I hope they had no illusions about, they'll just probably let us stay here. I think they were ready and prepared for arrest. I don't know if they knew how it was exactly going to go down, but it was gonna. But yeah, that's an interesting thing. I'd like to know more about what Brown negotiated for itself. And of course, it's still a developing situation, and you may find that come next semester, the students there are entirely dissatisfied with their solution and reoccupy an encampment.
Right. Here's another suggestion for college administrators.
All right.
Go back and look at your rules and procedures. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not the house, but rules and procedures still matter.
Yes.
And in many cases, like at Columbia, your rules and procedures are supposed to be protests are okay, and if you think they're not, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to consult with the college senate, which is basically the professors, and come up with a process. Okay. Then you can call the police.
All right.
It's unlikely Columbia did that.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a nimble process, but it's
a process.
But
it's a process. If you follow the process,
you adopt it. It's your process.
Then you're in a much stronger position with your faculty.
Yes. Now there's also the counterexample of I forget. I'm losing track of which campus is which here, but either I don't know, the Texas, or maybe it was Washington University of St. Louis, where the procedures were adopted the day before in sort of a closed door session.
At a place like Texas, where the governor is a right-wing nut job, and it's a public university, and the California system, public university, is very different than the private systems.
Yes.
So you'd think in Texas, the public universities would be a lot less accommodating to protest, whereas in California they'd be more accommodating just because who the governors are.
Well, you'd think, but
that's probably what happened.
Maybe you think taxes are lower.
In other words, UCLA didn't get disrupted until the outside agitators came.
Yeah.
Whereas Texas was a different story altogether. So each university has its own things going on. It's not all the same everywhere.
That's right. You can't just do Brown elsewhere necessarily. Sorry.
Yeah, for example.
Yeah.
And then, again, for those of you with short memories like me, who had to look it up.
Who are you again?
You probably don't remember this because it was, like 2020, so it was like 4 years ago.
Yes. When?
But there was an Occupy protest in Seattle.
Well,
for a long time, where protesters took over the streets, a couple of intersections.
Okay.
Right?
Yes, I do remember this. I mean, not the details, but yeah, sure.
Well, here's some details.
Okay.
Which is, I was laughing as I read them. They first called themselves the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. Then they had a fight within the organization. Then they renamed it the Capitol Hill Organized Protest, or CHOP. So it went from Chaz to CHOP. But originally it was Free Capitol Hill. And then other factions started calling it the Capitol Hill Occupied Protest. So it was a self-declared autonomous zone, which took months to clear.
Yes. Okay, now I remember.
This happened because of the George Floyd protests. There's no question about the motivation in my mind. I'm anti-George Floyd killing. But you could argue about the tactics.
Yes.
And, it ended up with the police coming in and clearing the area.
Yes.
And, what's more leftist than arguing over the name? That's why the People's Liberation of People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front is just so funny.
I guess the only thing more leftist is arguing about whether and how many different types of non-dairy milk there have to be at the encampment breakfast buffet.
Right. And like Occupy Wall Street, self-organized without official leadership.
Yes.
When that happens, you get chaos.
Very often the case, yes. And, of course, it also led to Republicans campaigning then and still now on the unfounded precept that most cities in America are vast wastelands that burn to the ground.
Yeah. So, it's not helpful politically. It's not helpful in terms of getting your goal. It's not helpful in terms of defining what the goal is, because sometimes the goal, like in the Brown divestiture, as we went over, can be complicated. And you can be sympathetic to the goals, like that Columbia student who just wants to get the class.
Yeah.
And, and you have to keep all of that in mind. And so sometimes you scratch your head and say, look, it's good to hear from the 68 Mark Rudd's SDS people about what happened in those days, because that didn't necessarily end the way that they intended. And, it's unfortunate that the universities haven't learned anything in the intervening, 100 years. I was like 14 and 15 when all of this stuff was happening, and I still remember. And there was a vast political difference between 68 and 69. Incredible. Vast difference. Well, in 68, Nixon beat Humphrey by a few points, which, as most astute observers point out, wasn't because of the protests. It was because of the white backlash against LBJ's civil rights program.
Okay.
But 69, Nixon's already president. Everybody's protesting the Vietnam War and Nixon. Protest becomes more popular. Not that popular, because Nixon is reelected in a landslide in 72. So people looking back and saying, well, the protests were incredibly popular across the country and changed everything. That's actually not what happened.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Certainly,
you may remember it
made
fondly because you participated, but that's not what happened.
That's true, but yeah, they made a tremendous cultural imprint, certainly, but
clearly
that's
important.
But we've been through that with protests.
The way that you now think they did.
That's that
took another 20 years.
Maybe, and then of course I'm thinking again now of people who were involved in initial Iraq War protests, and hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, and there were, and then yet. Well, it seems like there are even more people in this country than those hundreds of thousands. And they didn't like it. That is interesting. Why did they get ignored? Well, most people wanted the baseball scores, like they wanted to get to their classes at the university.
Right. So, again, this is the big story because it's happening now. It's happening yesterday, today, et cetera.
Yes.
But, you got to see where it is even next week, let alone next month or next year. And don't make assumptions about, well, this is the no, it's not the defining thing. There may be a ceasefire. I mean,
that's
Israel, non-Netanyahu Israel, and Biden are pushing for a ceasefire, and they're pushing Hamas to accept it. The problem in the Middle East is the same problem we always have.
You figured
Both
it out.
Netanyahu and Hamas, the radicals on either side, don't want peace.
Yeah. And neither do certain pro-Israel outside agitators in the Los Angeles area.
Right. So,
there's nuts
what happens
around here.
How do you negotiate that? And that's what they're working with. And again, I come back and say, it's still bothersome to me that therefore this is all Biden's fault. Well, why aren't you protesting Republicans who are part and parcel of demonizing you? You don't think that's even worth discussing. It's all about Biden. Therefore, when you say that, I don't take you seriously.
Yeah, that is problematic, and I mean it's certainly worth remembering, if for no other reason than just your own strategic planning. If you're among the protesters, that the awful reaction that you're getting from administrations on certain campuses are largely driven by the Republican demands on these administrations that you're not protesting.
Yeah,
which
so,
is interesting.
Again, another political cartoon. Oh. A guy standing there saying out loud, I can't in good conscience vote for Biden because of what's going on in Gaza. Behind him is Donald Trump tapping him on the shoulder, and in Trump's hand is a deportation notice.
Yeah.
Hello.
That's coming too. All right. Well,
other things that are coming from Trump, and this is really sort of fascinating.
Emanating from
Trump
him?
agreed to a Time magazine interview.
Yes.
Time, capital letters.
Yes. It's
and
time
in it,
to capitalize
he said
every letter.
some remarkable, incredible things.
Yes.
He says...
We should talk about them.
Yeah, a synopsis. What emerged from 2 interviews with Trump and conversations with more than a dozen of his aides.
Oof.
Okay.
What a nightmare.
He wants an imperial presidency that would reshape America and its role in the world, carry out deportation operations designed to remove more than 11 million people from the country.
Yeah, maybe.
Trump told me he'd be willing to build migrant detention camps and deploy the U.S. military at the border and inland.
Yeah.
He'd let red states monitor women's pregnancies and prosecute those who violate abortion bans. He would, at his personal discretion, withhold funds appropriated by Congress, according to top advisors. Don't forget, that was his first impeachment.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't spend the money with Zelensky.
Yes, right.
Not unless Zelensky came up with dirt. He'd be willing to fire a U.S. attorney, doesn't carry out his order to prosecute. Forget independent prosecutions. He's weighing pardons for every one of his supporters. This is bad stuff. And why did he give this interview to Time? Because he's 30 years in the past, and Time was the one who would make him Person of the Year. He thinks Time is like still a big organization. That's why.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. Forgot about that. All right, we'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We just had another show during the break. It's largely on the same points. You haven't missed anything. We're sharing it all with you.
So, communications director for the White House under Trump was Elisa Farrah Griffin, now a never-Trumper. And she's warned that the Donald Trump's potential second administration will be staffed by, quote, either liars or lunatics, end quote. And the reason she says that is this Time interview and other things.
Yeah, she's right. Of course, she's also guilty, but she's right.
They'd staff his administration with acolytes who back his false assertion that the 2020 election was stolen. And so, this is what he's threatening. And
it is.
It's threatening the country. And I don't mean I am going to do this, unless you give me what I want. I'm saying this is a threat to the country, and it's up to the Biden administration's campaign, not the president, but the campaign, to make sure that everybody understands this.
Yes. It was a nightmare of an interview. I read the transcript that was provided along with it by Time Magazine, which is wise. I mean, we're always actually calling for them to do that because the distillation of the comments that Trump actually makes them as he makes them it's an astonishing process to watch them try and get a coherent statement out of the bits and pieces they're given.
So, speaking of astonishing process.
All right.
Let's turn to the Trump trial.
Okay.
And let me tell you a little bit about astonishing process.
All right.
Okay.
Very little.
For a process person, you don't seem all that interested in process.
You know why? It's funny. We do it well here, but it's like reporting to work each morning, and you realize, I like the part where we just sit around and chat. But okay, I'll think now.
We'll sit around and chat about process.
Sure,
that's what we do. But this is about the trial.
Okay.
Okay, and just a legal point here that I'm going to make, being not a lawyer.
Okay. I just
Trump
want to put him in jail.
Says things.
He does.
Okay.
Right.
Sometimes it's on tape.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's a transcript, like you were referring to.
Yes. Person, woman, man.
Yeah. And so, it's there. What's to argue about? But if you're a Trump lawyer, you argue about it. You argue about the provenance. You argue about whether it's real.
Right. It's an AI transcript.
So there are a couple of cases where Trump made statements about basically taking responsibility for things, one of which was on C-SPAN.
Okay.
It's on tape.
Yes. Government owns it.
And they're introducing it as evidence in this trial in New York.
Okay. About
him, trying to swing the election. And one of the statements is something along the lines of, this is really important because if 5 or 10% of my voters believe this, I'm going to lose.
Uh-huh. He said that?
He said that. And it's on tape, and I think it was a C-SPAN tape. And I forget the other example of where he said something, but in both cases, the prosecutor had to subpoena the person in charge of C-SPAN archives to come and testify at the trial that, yes, this is real. Why is that necessary? Because the Trump lawyer was contesting it.
Yes. Well, that's not all that unusual, although I think maybe the remedy.
Well, he's had bunches of other trials, and he hasn't, and it's all about the lay. But if that's your game, what you can do is simply get people who can certify, yep, this is real. It's like getting a notary to say, yes, I notarized that. Okay, that's my statement. I was on the stand for 35 seconds. It's the only reason you brought me here from South Africa.
Well, what were you doing there?
At the people's expense, so I could get on the stand and say, yep, that's real. Thank you very much. I'm going.
Yeah.
And that happened the other day.
Okay.
It's a process thing, but that's why they had those people there to verify the fact that Trump actually said that, so he can't challenge later that, from a fact point of view, I'm not an expert on this, but I don't think that at summary you're allowed to bring up stuff that hasn't already been adjudicated during the trial. So the prosecution got it out in the trial now and say, now I can say it in the summary.
Well, right, sure. That I was going to say it's sort of normal trial process, except of course they take it to the extreme. But you, having seen courtroom dramas, will probably be enough. It's very similar in many ways to congressional procedure, where you say, all right, well, all of this stuff needs to be established as fact and and accepted by both sides, whatever, before you begin the debate about it. And it's usually a pro forma thing. In your courtroom drama, you usually see, well, okay, there's photographs of the crime scene, and what do you see happen before it's introduced as evidence? They show it to the defense, and the judge and both counsel ask, does everybody agree that this is a photo of the crime scene? They look at it. No objections, Your Honor. All right, then you'd like it marked as evidence and entered into...
We'll call that
evidence.
Exhibit 3.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so you've seen that exchange happening. Now, what happens, nobody asks, because a movie has to happen inside of an hour and a half or 2 hours. Nobody asks, what happens if they hand it over to the defense counsel and they say, no, I don't agree that this is a photo of the crime scene. I don't know where this came from.
Then you're entitled to say that. There testify, I was the photographer,
yes.
I took it, I gave it to the police. And yes, and
sometimes an affidavit will do for that, and sometimes the defense says no, we need to produce the photographer.
So that happens.
They make you do it.
If you step back and look at the big picture here, it's just clear what's going on, and the prosecution is doing a marvelous job.
Yes.
And you can tell that from the
Mars
cross-examination, abbreviated by those in the know as cross.
Yes.
Where
that's our cross.
The prosecution comes in and says, "Let me tell you a story,
Let
Mr.
me
and Mrs.
tell you the story
members of the jury
another
and Ms. and whatever.
Yeah.
Let me tell you a story. Okay, Donald Trump was running for president. The Access Hollywood tape happened. Mm-hmm. He was incredibly fearful that this would cost him the election, hence the C-SPAN piece that I just mentioned. And so David Pecker, who is the head of AMI, which owns the National Enquirer and a good friend of Trump's, decided to kill a bunch of stories because it would be harmful to the campaign. Not because Trump was concerned about Melania. He never mentioned Melania. But
he never does.
He was really, really concerned that this was going to hurt his campaign. He wouldn't be elected. So he did those things. Mm-hmm. And under New York state law, that would be concealing that would be a felony. But falsifying business records to conceal it, would be a misdemeanor.
Yes.
Faking business records would be a misdemeanor, but if you fake the business records in order to conceal the other misdemeanor, that's actually a felony.
Yes.
And that's what happened, and this is what's going on. And so then our first witness is going to be David Pecker, who's going to tell the story. And Pecker tells an incredibly compelling story about exactly how that worked in a clear and simple way that everybody could understand.
Well, he does write a tabloid.
And he said, look, what matters is the headlines.
Yeah.
And you have to understand tabloids. And again, I grew up in New York City, New York Post and Daily News. And those tabloids, not the National Enquirer, but those tabloids, I think it was the New York Post, just had the greatest tabloid headline of all time.
Really?
Yeah. Headless man found at topless bar.
Okay. Yeah, that's all right. We're going back in history. Okay.
Yes, but that's what they do. You don't have to read the story.
Mm-hmm.
There is a story behind that. It doesn't matter.
Right.
You see that cover, you buy the paper.
I got to figure out what this is about.
If you're in the news, kiosk in those days, or if you're in the supermarket in the aisle in those days, the days that Time magazine mattered in terms of who was Person of the Year.
Yeah.
And that's when this was taking place. You see the headlines and they matter. So Pecker's explaining the headlines mattered, and here's what we did. We had a scheme, which we knew was illegal. So we had to keep it secret from everybody, he says to the jury.
Oh.
And what we did is we would buy the story from people like Karen McDougal or Stormy Daniels,
rights to the story,
and then not publish it, which is called catch and kill. That's what we did.
Is that illegal?
And we did it in order to protect the Trump campaign. And everybody in the organization understood we did it to protect the Trump campaign. So then, he has somebody else verify that. And then a little bit further on in the trial, he has the lawyer, Keith Davidson, who happens to be the lawyer for both Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels.
Yes.
Small world.
Right. Very.
And he basically corroborates every single thing that David Pecker says, only from the other side. He's representing the women. Mm-hmm. Pecker's representing AMI and National Enquirer. But it's the same story down to the smallest detail.
Amazing.
If you're going to lie about this with a really super complicated scheme, you're not going to have corroborating evidence from the other side that is going to match every single detail, where the prosecution can then bring in, and look at the C-SPAN thing where Trump believed it and said the same thing. I mean, it all fits together. It's a masterful job in that sense.
Yes.
It's very, very hard for
the
defense to step back and say, well, that's not the way it happened. They tried. The original cross-examination, the original cross of David Pecker was, well, you didn't just do that for Trump. You did it for Arnie Schwarzenegger and a whole bunch of other people.
Yeah.
Who cares?
All right.
What happened with Trump is what's on trial, and everybody else is corroborating what happened. So by the time Michael Cohen comes around to testifying, and the defense is all lined up to say Michael Cohen is an unreliable source, Who cares? The jury's already heard the whole story. It's been corroborated. It's going to be corroborated a bunch of other times. And it all hangs together. And that's what the jury's going to remember. And so the trial is just not going well for Trump.
Well,
And that's just
nice.
on the legal side.
Yes.
On the political side, he looks weak. He looks diminished. I mean, there's articles about this. They're all true. He and Fox News are trying to make the case that he's magnified by this. He's a martyr. Sure. He's standing like a colossus astride. His falling asleep is a protest against the powers that be. Just like the Columbia, occupation zones.
He's demonstrating his contempt for a process that's beneath him by sleeping through it. They're actually telling him that. Yeah,
it's not working for him. It's just not working. That's the big picture. That's why I don't take these polls right now seriously.
Okay.
This is what's going on, and this is what's going to seep in. So for all of those people who said, well, this isn't a particularly strong case, this is an amazing case. Are people hearing about it? Absolutely. And those that don't will hear about the verdict. And when you look and see what the prosecution is putting together, you can very easily see how Trump gets convicted.
Yep.
Because what's his defense? His first defense is I didn't sleep with them. That's not going to fly. Okay. Not after everything that we heard.
Yeah.
Okay. And then his second defense is, well, this is typical National Enquirer policy they do with everybody. No, they didn't. They were killing stories that would have been great for them. That would have been wonderful headlines for them. Sure. And you know about the headline because David Pecker testified about how important those headlines are.
Yes.
So I don't see how the defense mounts a credible defense because the facts are just so overwhelming.
You pound the table.
And the next half of the case is to prove that they falsified business records. That's boring, but I think they just have that because that's what the documents say.
Yes. Well,
this part was the predicate. This part was the important part. Why were they doing that? It was for the campaign, and I think they've established that.
Sounds good. I forgot about Keith. It's Keith Davidson representing both of them. I was just thinking they could have used I don't know, like a borrow from Bananas at that point, like to dismiss him after questioning him about his representation of Karen McDougal, and then say, "I now call to the stand Stormy Daniels' attorney, Keith Davidson," and make him come back and say, "You again, sir? I am astonished. How did it happen that you represented both of these women?"
Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, it's like in that sleazy world, like there aren't a lot of people who want to do stuff like that.
Yeah, that's true too. But it also probably establishes for the jury, even if they leave it unstated, that's how much of an automated conveyor belt process this was at the National Enquirer. They even had a Rolodex of one lawyer. Where, do you think this is unusual? Do you think you need representation and all this? I got a lawyer for you.
Keith Davidson was responsible for a tremendous number of our scoops.
Yeah, I mean,
small world.
It's easy to get those agreements if you also can hire the lawyer for the other side.
Right, and the other side of the coin, of course, is the prosecution, and they're absolutely going to use this line in some fashion. Mm-hmm. Look. You may not like Michael Cohen or Keith Davidson or even David Pecker, but we don't choose them. Trump chose them.
Yeah.
That's why they're here at the trial.
Right. And even the people who were getting their payoffs, they didn't really choose them either. You handed it to them. No wonder you were able to catch and kill stories for, relatively speaking, given the importance to a presidential campaign, a very small amount of money.
Yeah.
So... Wow, the trial's exciting. He can't stay awake during it, but that's his problem. The rest of us are enjoying it just fine.
So let's turn to Congress.
Okay. Are they doing anything?
Well, sort of. I mean, they're back from recess.
I'll
give you a tidbit.
All right.
It's Wednesday.
Yeah.
That means yesterday was Tuesday. And you know what happens in this country on Tuesdays?
Tacos.
Elections.
Oh, I missed the other part. No wonder. They're so boring this time. Okay.
New York 26th Congressional District special election results.
There was one?
The Democrat, Timothy Kennedy, 68.2. Gary Dixon, the Republican, 31.8.
Wow.
Timothy Kennedy will represent the 26th District, which is the Buffalo area.
All right.
It has two counties, Niagara County, which is sparsely populated, around 12,000 people. Republican County. Went for the Republican, not at all.
Oh.
Niagara went for Kennedy 56-44, and Erie, which is where Buffalo is, Erie County, Kennedy 71, Dixon 29.
Wow.
So basically, he wins by more than 30 points in a district that was a D+9 district. So in other words, yet again, the Democrats overperform in a special election.
Terrific. And he's mowing your lawn.
Yeah, he is. Well,
it's a riding mower. It's a long trip from Buffalo.
Right.
Okay. Well, that is good news. I imagine abortion had something
on my
to do
line,
with it,
screaming
too.
at the guy mowing along, saying, "You released Karen McDougal from his NDA."
Well, he just screams at anybody who mows lawns. Right. That's the thing he does. All right. Well, that's certainly great news. And what is it? I guess we got to take a look at the numbers in Congress again.
That's exactly what I'm looking right now. So
go to
party
Wikipedia
breakdown right now.
Yeah.
Okay. 200 and let's see, is that right? 217 Republicans and 212 Democrats.
All right. That could be. I mean, we just did have there was a death recently among the Democratic incumbents, Donald Payne Jr.
Yes,
so that changed
died
numbers.
April 24th. Mm-hmm. Then again, the day after, Mike Gallagher, Republican, resigned.
Right.
So that balances out. So if that happens.
Yeah.
Okay, 217 Republicans. Now we have 213 Democrats.
Okay.
Okay. So 217. Let's say you lose one, and they vote with the Democrats.
216,
now you got
214.
216, 214.
Right.
Republicans win. But if you lose two,
215, 215.
And a tie doesn't go to the vice president, a tie is a loss in the House. That means that the Republicans can only lose one vote for the time being.
All right.
Till they fill the other 6 vacancies.
Let's see if they can't lose that one vote and then lose all the votes after that.
So that's what's going on. So Mike Johnson has no leeway whatsoever. And yet the big news in Congress is that Mike Johnson is giving a press conference about how things are going. And in the midst of the press conference, the Democratic caucus releases a press statement.
Oh.
Joint Democratic leadership statement on motion to vacate.
Oh.
For months, House Republicans are being jerks. This is a 3-paragraph thing. I won't bore you with the first 2 paragraphs, but the 3rd paragraph is what matters. At this moment, upon completion of our national security work, the time has come to turn the page on this chapter of pro-Putin Republican obstruction. We will vote to table Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene's motion to vacate the chair. If she invokes the motion, it will not succeed.
Okay.
So basically, the Democrats say they're going to support Mike Johnson. Marjorie Taylor Greene has no teeth. She can sit down and shut up because she ain't going nowhere. She gets furious. She loses her temper. She starts screaming that this obviously proves that the Democrat speaker, Mike Johnson, yada, 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 yada.
The Fox News label.
And it's incredible. And so it takes all the air out of her.
Well, I would... Believe me, I've always wanted all the air to be taken out of her.
Yeah.
And never to be replaced.
Never to be replaced.
But
so, there's a lot of discussion about what's the strategy here. And then you go back to, remember all those people who said it was a bad idea for Democrats to not support Kevin McCarthy? It was a great idea. Kevin McCarthy was never trustworthy. Kevin McCarthy was never going to give the Democrats what they needed. Mike Johnson did. He kept his word to them. It's not that they made backroom deals. It's that he wound up using Democratic votes to support stuff that Democrats wanted. Could not have worked out better for Democrats. Now, and this is the other strategy part of it, okay? So Marjorie Taylor Greene is really angry because her motion to vacate isn't going anywhere. Mike Johnson starts working the Republicans. And Mike Johnson is convincing enough Republicans to not support the vote that it's sort of embarrassing that Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't have the votes. So stories start to be written They're starting to be written. They may not have been published, but writers are starting these stories about how Mike Johnson turned it all around, how Mike Johnson is much more savvy than you think, how Mike Johnson is the real hero. And then Hakeem Jeffries says, we're not supporting a motion to vacate. Marjorie Taylor Greene has no teeth, and it's because of us. Now all of a sudden you can't say, and Mike Johnson can't say, well, it was all my doing.
Yeah.
Hakeem Jeffries doesn't have to say a word. He shrugs his shoulders and says, sure, Mike.
Yeah.
Sure, Ken.
I mean,
it was your doing. Everybody knows that.
I guess you flipped the switch and Mike Johnson hasn't fixed anything.
Right.
You want me to flip this switch?
And by the way, he never had fixed anything. It's just those stories get written because that's how the media works.
Yeah.
But this is fantastic because now it's arguably like Mike Johnson was so inept. The hapless Mike Johnson needed Democratic votes to stay in power. Whether that's true or not, that's a story now.
That's a headline. David Pecker can go with that.
And as you know, people only read the headlines.
Right. All right. Yeah, that's pretty good. I'm always happy when Marjorie Taylor Greene is unhappy, and she's always unhappy. So so far, it's been pretty good for me.
So this is a piece by conservative Andrew Egger writing in The Bulwark, Hakeem Jeffries' Mike Johnson bear hug, where he outlines exactly that. But he goes on with, how Mike Johnson pulled off getting in good with the Republicans so that his job was semi-protected, basically because they're sick and tired of all this stuff. But does that make Jeffries' announcement a strategic error? Shouldn't they at least have waited for Greene to forge ahead before tipping their hand? Not from their point of view. Mike Johnson, who has stared Greene down on his own terms, would have won. He would have been a considerably empowered Mike Johnson. And why would Democrats want to see an empowered Republican speaker? But by doing this now, Democrats can take credit for his survival. They can be seen by the public as acting like serious, responsible, institutionally minded lawmakers, in a word, grown-ups. And they can also drive a fresh wedge between him and a MAGA base, because now Marjorie Taylor Greene is ranting about the Democrat Speaker Mike Johnson.
Sure.
It's the surest way to ensure Johnson still won't get anything done this Congress without significant Democratic help. So, win for the Democrats. Well played, Hakeem Jeffries.
Well, good.
He hasn't established the kind of track record that Nancy Pelosi has, but he's off to an awfully good start.
Yeah. It's hard to establish the record of a person who was speaker for 10 years if you have not yet been speaker and have been at the head of the party for 1 year.
Yeah, so he's coming in doing pretty well as a minority leader.
Well, he's had a lot of good advice.
It's the House. I mean, nobody wants to be in the minority in the House, even by one vote.
Right, but I mean, if you're going to do it, it's not even all that common a thing for people to know the name of the minority leader.
Well, again, really I think that if you step back and look at it, the person you can thank for all of that is Kevin McCarthy, because he wrecked the Speakers Committee.
Thank you, Kevin. Where are you?
So, Kevin McCarthy deserves a lot of credit.
Finally.
But not for what he intends to have credit for. And he's still trying to, rehab himself. It ain't working.
Well, there are various paths to rehabilitation. You talk to George Santos about that.
And then I'm going to end my segment today with this TNR, The New Republic.
Oh, all right.
And this is a piece, I think, by Greg Sargent, I want to say.
Almost certainly.
And it almost certainly is. Trump is now raging at his own lawyer and wrecking a big MAGA fantasy. Over at Fox News, even Trump's naps are a power move.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned that.
Nobody knows it more than Trump himself, and that's why he's yelling at his lawyer, because his lawyer isn't aggressive enough. He can't be aggressive with this judge.
He can be aggressive with any judge, really.
And remember,
not like this. Yeah.
Trump's whole strategy is to demand that his lawyer stick to Trump's fantasies.
Right.
So in this fantasy, Trump wants his lawyer to declare at every moment that, look, I never slept with these women.
Yes.
And I'm a reliable person.
In Time Magazine interview, by the way, that you mentioned, he still denies ever having encountered Jean Carroll.
Right.
So, he's a wacko. And he wants, this came up earlier, that Trump demands performances from his lawyers that will get his lawyers in trouble, which is why you keep seeing them disbarred at the conclusion of every
in this particular
proceeding.
trial. I mean, to remind you, Blanche was told by the judge, you're losing all credibility. That was on day 2 of the trial.
Yeah, because you're doing the things that your client demands. Because
you're trying to do what Trump tells you to do. You can't do that.
He's not a lawyer. Don't listen to him.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they all get in trouble. They all get disbarred. The client gets fined, and they were warned again the other day. This judge, again, like all the others, taking a cautious approach to jailing Trump, but saying, I got to tell you, this has to ultimately be the result if you just keep doing this. You can't just keep making your lawyers break all the rules because you don't like court.
Yeah. So, again, the story here is that behind the scenes he's really mad at Todd Blanche. But the fact of the matter is, the reason he's mad is because, he knows the trial isn't going that well.
Yeah. So he just wants to do the Saddam Hussein thing where he stands and objects to the fact that this court has even been convened.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, they hanged that guy, so I just tell you should probably tread lightly. That's one of the things, right? He wants real aggressive lawyers. And he's used to seeing aggressive lawyers because he's used to dealing in a civil context, and B, in depositions. It's just not a thing that you can do to yell at judges. It just doesn't work like that in court. I mean, you can do it, or you've seen it in the movies, but in reality, when you yell at the judge, you tend to lose a lot of rulings and then lose your case.
Yeah.
So, to the extent that you care about winning, don't do that. But maybe the goal here isn't winning for Todd Blanche. I don't know. Well,
anyway, that's all I got for today,
all
which
right.
is a good thing because it's 9:57
that's
and
all
I'm
you're going
done
to be
anyway,
allowed.
and it's almost time for the break.
Yes. All right, that's true. Before you go, I want you to know I mentioned George Santos as a possible model for rehabilitation for Kevin McCarthy. The new story on George Santos.
Kevin McCarthy's going to run for New York 1?
No, and neither is George Santos. He's dropping out of that, but he is, however, going to bring back his drag queen alter ego for cameo videos. He's ready to get in drag again.
I think that's probably a safer route for Rudy Giuliani, to be honest.
That's a possibility, too. Yeah, maybe. At any rate, I mean, Kevin, it's not like he's untrainable. He might be teachable in this, and I think we'd all like to see him try. But there you go. Katara is being brought not only out of retirement, but out of the closet. George Santos, who once denied ever performing as a drag queen, now says he'll do it for money. So why not send him a check? How do you like that? That's an interesting development. We could talk about it more tomorrow, except actually that's all there is on that subject. Thanks, Greg, and we'll see you tomorrow. All right, time now to return to the show. Welcome back, everybody, to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Last-minute conversation with Greg Dworkin. I'll tell you what's going on that had him hold on during the break, because this is of some interest, I'm sure, to all of you. He points me to the Twitter entry from Chad Pergram, senior congressional correspondent for Fox News, which is unfortunately a real organization, even if they're not telling you the real news. But this appears to be new and real. Republican representative from Nebraska. What's Congressman Bacon's first name? I don't know. Exon, I guess. But Representative Bacon says he will be introducing a resolution to censure Minnesota Democratic Representative Ilhan Omar. Is it Don Bacon? Okay, yeah, that's right. Probably true. So he's going to be introducing a resolution censuring Representative Ilhan Omar. Over what? I'm not exactly sure. They're always ready to try to censure Ilhan Omar. But he won't call it up. So he was just asking, so what does that mean? Does this mean nothing's going to happen? Is it a real thing? Is it a stunt? It's a real thing. You can introduce a resolution of censure at any time, I guess, against anybody you want. The issue is this. In order to actually censure the person, one requires a vote on the House floor. Simple majority is all that's necessary. You're not ejecting. You're not. I'm blanking on the actual term of art here, but you're not expelling. There we are. Not ejecting, but you're not expelling Ilhan Omar, which would, of course, require a 2/3 vote of the House, but merely censuring, which is the next level of punishment down. There's not a whole lot of routes to punish members of Congress for anything, but expulsion requires a 2/3 vote. Censure, only a majority vote. Censure involves, in addition to formally condemning whatever it is that was done, but you are brought to the well of the House and admonished by the Speaker for your bad behavior, if that is indeed what it is. But if the House decides it is, then that's what happens to you. And, it's not great. And then you can also get a reprimand, which is different, or you can be brought up on charges by the Ethics Committee, et cetera, et cetera. But censure is a thing. It's a real measure. It's relatively rare, and it's relatively rare that the House resorts to it. What does it mean here? That he's introducing a resolution to censure Ilhan Omar but won't call it up. What it means is, ordinarily, when you're trying to invoke censure on somebody, it's usually because something fairly serious has happened and that you have a fairly serious shot at getting a majority of the House to agree that it is serious enough to interrupt business, to consider the resolution imposing censure, and then go through with the punishment. But, and because that's usually serious, ordinarily when you introduce such a measure, you introduce it with the intention of seeking privileged consideration of it, which is a thing that backbenchers can do, although it's a lot easier when the floor leadership of one party or another brings it up. It is more quickly considered on the question of whether or not it is in fact privileged, and if you can get that, if you can get the chair to agree that it's a privileged motion, when a party leader brings it up, you can have immediate consideration of it. If a backbencher brings it up, even if you get a ruling that yes, indeed, it does present a question of privilege, and that's not always a given, but if it does present a question of privilege and that question survives, that privilege survives a vote, say, appealing that ruling from the chair, if you get to that point, then even if you're a backbencher, you can get yourself a vote on it and floor consideration on it, but not necessarily immediately following the ruling that it represents a question of privilege. But ordinarily, if you're censuring someone, you can usually win that vote. If you've got a serious case against the person, you say it's a question of the privileges of the House, it affects the reputation of the House as a whole, that's the sort of thing that usually gets you privilege. That's if you're trying very hard to actually bring it up. What Don Bacon is saying is, I will file a resolution and just drop it in the hopper, and they will refer it to committee, and I don't intend to push at all for, at least not now, for expedited privileged consideration. I'm just introducing a resolution that says I think Ilhan Omar is an annoying person and putting it in there, and whether or not it ever gets considered, it'll be referred to committee, and the committee will do next to nothing with it probably, and nothing will happen. At some later date, I could attempt to bring it up. Is it real? Sure. Would they be able to get such a thing together? Well, if they get absolute unanimity among the Republicans, they still have technically enough people to bring it up for consideration and to actually adopt it if they all show up to work that day. But again, given the fact that there's a two vote margin here, and on any given day there are 6 to 10 Republicans and 6 to 8 Democrats that are just absent for no particular reason, that's probably the reason that he's not calling it up. What is he censuring her about? I don't even know. Doesn't even matter. But I imagine it probably has something to do with her advocacy for, I don't know, advocacy for Gaza, perhaps, or some statement that she made along the way about Israel, or something that's the usual target for these guys. So I guess expect nothing to happen for the moment. How about that? All right. Well, I think that wraps it up for what's happening with Ilhan Omar. And, let's turn our attention elsewhere. Although I did want to mention that there was something that Justice sent along about the protest at Columbia. I guess as we were saying, well, okay, they went to occupy this office building and did so, and almost certainly expected arrest at some point. Arguing against the expectation or against the fact that they had to expect arrest is perhaps the statement from one of the student organizers. I saw a brief video clip of it yesterday, essentially saying, well, I mean, what it comes down to is this. The students were saying that you should be taking care, that the administration somehow was responsible for providing for food and beverage, water at the minimum, to be provided to the students occupying this office, this building, I guess combination classroom office building, Hamilton Hall, which they, of course, we mentioned in yesterday's show, ceremonially renamed in honor of a young Palestinian who had been killed early on in the fighting in the Israeli bombing raids of Gaza. But that's sort of beside the point. But they were saying, well, the problem is we're inside this building and there's no food in this building, and you should be providing food and water for the people occupying the building, which is kind of one of those things that if you take over a building, you kind of have to do the logistical planning for that yourself and either bring or arrange for constant supply of food and water. It's not, you can't just DoorDash food to yourself this way and continually occupy the building. And the complaint was, well, I mean, I guess someone must say, are you saying the administration is supposed to feed you while you occupy their offices? And the student response, I mean, I guess debating society, right? You got to come up with some response. And she was saying, well, to the extent that they care about the health and welfare of the students, I mean, you don't want them starving or dropping from dehydration in the middle of campus, do you? Well, you don't, but if you go on a hunger strike inadvertently because you've barricaded yourself in a building with no food, I don't know if that's really an administration obligation, though it may be the case that they send you some water because they don't want people being removed in ambulances. That's true, but I don't know. That seemed kind of odd, to say the least. Is this it? Is this the justices sent me a link here? Yeah, here it is. Here's the this we'll include this in our roundup for everybody to see. Yes, a reporter grilling a Columbia student after she demands that the university help feed protesters occupying Hamilton Hall. It seems like you're saying, we want to be revolutionaries. We want to take over this building. Now, would you please provide us some food? And yeah, that's kind of what's being asked. I don't know. So, yeah, I guess that's a counter to the careful planning of the occupation of Hamilton Hall. I thought they almost certainly expected to be arrested, but if you show me that they really sort of didn't make any provision for food and water, then I guess I would say maybe they didn't plan all that well anyway. And I don't know that water service has been cut off to Hamilton Hall. You could probably get yourself some water. As for food, well, you might be SOL about that. But that's what happens when you barricade yourself into places. That's sort of, the immediate outlook for most occupations / sieges for centuries now, millennia, really. Anyway, just thought that was of some interest, and yeah, they probably should have planned for that one. Speaking as we were earlier with Greg about the question of, well, how are the protests seen on a national level among the entirety of the populace? Philip Bump actually did publish on just that point, saying that views of the campus protests are too broad and too narrow. That's how complex they are. What happens on college campuses is constantly overestimated by the media or in the media. That's certainly true and has been the case of late, and a real complaint among progressive types as well. In this case, what's happening is also being treated incorrectly as a microcosm making that point in a couple of paragraphs across this piece. Protests on the campus of Columbia University escalated on Monday when students broke into and occupied a building on campus hours after a deadline set by school administrators for shutting down an encampment had come and gone. The university's original effort to disband the encampment, inviting New York police officers to enter the campus and break it up, triggered a backlash, spurred enormous media attention, and inspired a surge in similar encampments at other schools. The story of the protests, a response to Israel's military occupation in Gaza after the October 7th attack by Hamas, has driven news cycles for days. This is partly because the media has long had an undue fascination with the goings-on at colleges, and in recent years it has often focused on a perceived muffling of individuals' free speech rights, which all of a sudden they're now in favor of course. It is mostly, though, because the protests offer something for everyone. Want a video clip of a college student not knowing that they're protesting or what they're protesting? You've got it. Looking for angry counter-protesters trying to goad the protesters into escalation? Sure thing. There is no shortage of extreme or bizarre views available for dissemination. Picking out anecdotes allows the protests to be easily presented in absolutist terms, useful for political maneuvering, if not much else. Put another way, two things can be true. It can be and is true that some participants in the protests have made objectively anti-Semitic comments. It also can be and is true that politicians and others are trying to score points by painting the protests with an overly broad brush. It's further true that politicians, particularly on the right, see the protests as an opportunity to demonstrate their hostility to left-wing speech. The backlash to Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 led to a robust anti-protest sentiment on the right that produced codification of laws and approaches aimed at cracking down on protest activity. Here is a chance to wield, or at least to threaten to wield, an iron fist against a group positioned as anti-Semitic and, more appealingly, against leftist college students. One way the protests have been diminished is by suggesting that college students are naive or trend followers, or they're being hoodwinked by professors somehow. I added the somehow there. It's a convenient way of looking at the situation for those who disagree with the admittedly often nebulous claims, or rather aims, of the protests. These kids don't know what they're doing. This argument, though, ignores two important things. The first is that most people making political decisions based on the influence of the groups, most people make political decisions based on the influence of the groups to which they belong. So it's fairly common. It's not just among college students. This is the entire point of, let's say, political parties. You trust that someone who shares your party identity also shares your politics. Younger people are generally less informed about political news, but it's not like older people are super well informed. A poll conducted by YouGov this year, for example, found that no more than 6 in 10 Americans knew about the various charges Donald Trump was facing. And he's on trial right now in the middle of New York City, with fewer than half of members of the Republican in-group knowing about any specific one. Then there's the other important aspect here. It's clear that many protesters, and probably most of them, know exactly what they're pushing back against. A Harvard youth poll released this month found that half of those under 30, the focus of their research, supported the idea of a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. Among those in college or who graduated from college, the figure was at and above 6 in 10. I guess then the question is, well, what's a permanent? This is a separate question. Well, what's a permanent ceasefire? What does ceasefire mean in this situation? Do I support a permanent ceasefire? Sure, everyone everywhere. Stop firing weapons. That's fantastic. Let's all do that. Can we get there? What does it actually mean? What will it actually require? I don't know. But like divestment, it's a tough one. But as a general concept, do we support it? Sure. Now back to the article. It has been the case consistently since the start of the conflict that younger Americans are less supportive of Israel's actions in Gaza, a difference in opinion that at one point triggered an undeserved backlash against TikTok. Well, okay. There, too, the argument was that young people were simply too naive and uninformed to have come to conclusions about the war on their own, and were instead lemmings being led around by anti-Israel actors. Looking specifically at the campus protests, though, there's no reason to think that the driving factor isn't exactly what it looks like. Young people oppose Israel's approach to the conflict more than older people, and college students are young. The protests include thousands of people around the country, small parts of the population at each school, reflecting, in part, the smaller number of people with fervent views on the issue. And young people are simply more likely to protest than older people. That's true, too. By focusing on the campus protests, we miss that most Americans, especially on the left, disagree with Israel's handling of the war and support a ceasefire, at least somewhat. The focus on those protests is too narrow for the subject. But again, it's also too broad. Most young people don't see the military operation in Gaza as a critically important issue relative to other political priorities. CNN released polling on Sunday looking at how Americans prioritized various issues when considering their presidential vote. The top issue overall was the economy. Stupid. I remember that one. Okay. The war in Gaza, climate change, and student loan relief were at the bottom. Among younger Americans, however, the rankings were different, or the ranking was different. For them, the top issue was the economy, and the bottom three issues were the same, except that climate change was 10th, not 11th. Okay, that's not that different. But interesting. This is, though, in keeping with the findings of the Harvard Youth poll, showing that what younger voters were worried about didn't differ that much from Americans overall. This is probably a large part of why President Biden's support from younger Americans is low relative to past presidential candidates. CNN also asked people how they viewed Biden's handling of various issues, including the war in Gaza. On the issues that were most likely to be viewed as important in deciding people's votes, Biden's approval was underwater, with more people disapproving of his handling than approving. The net approval shown below, we'll try and let you know as much as we can about what's on the charts here, but the net approval shown below subtracts his disapproval from his approval, generally resulting in a negative value. So there's some charts here that do demonstrate that. Notice on the numbers on Gaza, viewed as less important, with significantly more disapproval, particularly among younger voters. So yes, they disapprove in greater numbers, but put less emphasis on that particular subject in their voting decision overall, though there are certainly some people who would rank that at the top. Under 45, by the way, is admittedly not that young. That's the numbers they were using, but it's what we have to work with. In the CNN poll, anyway, polling enough people to get a big sample of actually young Americans can be prohibitively expensive. The timing of these protests is interesting, given that many of these universities are reaching the end of their school years, at which point the energy on display would presumably dissipate. We'll see what happens with that. In the meantime, the protests offer a terrific buffet for those interested, from reporters to activists to politicians. What is generally overlooked in doing so is both that the views espoused by the students are supported more broadly than many people recognize, but that even among younger Americans, they are less central to political views than we imagine. And that's been where a lot of the energy of the protesters has been expended in trying to convince people not necessarily what to think about Gaza or even how to respond to Gaza, but to remind people that, well, if genocide bothers you, and remember that we're using the term advisedly here, and they are, they're pushing for more Americans to accept using the term and making the arguments that it is one, and that if it is one, then you can't possibly put it as a lower priority than anything else, because wouldn't that be embarrassing for you to say that you care about the economy more than a genocide? How dare you? Well, that's the tactic. See how it works, understand how it works, and it puts you in an awkward position to have to push back against it by saying, well, it's not that not even that I disagree that that's what it is, if that's where your position is, or not that I diminish its importance, but, it's difficult and uncomfortable to say, yeah, it's a genocide, but it's an over there genocide. It makes me look insensitive and calloused, which is true, but it's also kind of the position of humanity over the course of many, many centuries and many, many millennia. Things that are more distant, that don't directly affect you, require an abstract way of thinking that doesn't serve everyone in the same way, and so is sometimes adopted by some people who are served better by it, and sometimes rejected by those who are served by rejecting it. That's the human condition, and frustrating but true. All right. Well, anyway, I thought that was an interesting addition to the discussion on all of that. Then there's the Time magazine thing, which, again, I just will... I'll say only this, because it would take... you could literally spend a week parsing the article that was produced from the interviews, and another week parsing the transcript of the actual discussion that takes place between the interviewer and Trump himself. The interviewer, I keep saying this, and I don't go back and say who it is. It's Eric Cortellessa, I guess is the pronunciation here. And Trump does name him in the transcript a couple of times. Eric. He's not talking to his son, Eric. It's I don't know what to tell you. There's some real alarm among many of you, and on social media, in the traditional media, elsewhere, over what's being espoused here. It's true and correct what Eric Cortellessa has distilled from the conversations, if you can even call them conversations, that he had with Donald Trump. He does say he'll do these horrible things, or doesn't disavow his intent to do some of these horrible things that are listed, and it's responsible and necessary for Eric Cortellessa to lay all that out clearly. But at the same time, if you read the transcript of what transpires between the two of them, at some point you get very frustrated with the reporter here too. Is it, why aren't you, I mean, I understand legally speaking, why you don't punch Trump in the face repeatedly in the course of this conversation. You're not allowed to do that. And it would probably end the interview. And you can't just, well, not for the same reasons, but you likewise, for other reasons, cannot simply say, are you effing kidding me? You haven't even come close to answering my question here. Shut your effing pie hole and answer the questions one at a time as they're posed to you. Stop with this rambling BS. As if Greg were there, he would certainly say yes, that was all bull. And his repeated tactic in all of this, and I guess at some level you have to give credit, like I said earlier, to Eric Cortellessa here for distilling something out of this discussion. But his tactic over and over again is to just wander into some other topic tangential to the issue at hand, and sometimes not even tangential, just it's a totally different subject, and to give partial sentence fragments that just don't hang together as an answer before going into some other stock rambling garbage that you say at rallies. It's really, most of the transcript is evidence of Trump mentally scrambling to try to get back to set pieces that he uses at rallies rather than actually answer the question. And I made fun of it yesterday by saying, well, sir, but what is your, because he calls him sir and he thanks him for his answers all the time, even though they're non-answers. Sir, thank you, but what is your policy on this subject? What is your policy going to be in your second term should you win re-election? And Trump essentially rambles and says, a string of nonsense words. Elephant, television, person, man, woman, camera, TV. That's my policy. I'm going to have a major statement about it out in the very short period of time, the next 2 weeks. I mean, he falls back on all of those same stupid rhetorical crutches. And then Eric, because he lacks anything else to say, what are you going to say to this guy that you want to continue the conversation with? Thank you. Well, no, not thank you. You're an idiot. But the interview would be over. I both recommend and recommend against reading the transcript. It will enlighten you to some degree of just what sort of the mental state Trump is in and the degeneration of his mental state. But it'll also infuriate you to some extent at Eric Cortellessa for not just saying, forget it. There's not a person behind these comments that I can endorse spending Time Magazine ink on. It's just too stupid. It just doesn't rise to the level of cognizance that's worth paying attention to, even in Time Magazine, which is considerably less worth paying attention to itself as an entity. That's a rather harsh indictment, but that's where we are. All right. So, okay. All I can really do at this point is give you thoughts on that because, like I said, it would take 1,000,000 years. The way I read things, 1,000,000 years to read through the article, 1.5 million to read through the transcript. It's just something you kind of have to see for yourself. So, we'll move on after this 2-minute break. We'll be right back. After, these messages, we'll say.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's see, how shall we spend our last segment? Something I didn't get to shoehorn in yesterday, but a continuation of what I thought was interesting and necessary background information on the protests, on the situation in Gaza in general, on the way we view these things, and the discourse surrounding them. Continuing with comments made by one observer who I thought to have made some interesting points that are, I think, largely overlooked in the main discourse on this subject, which is, of course, as Philip Bump and Greg point out, is taking place among a decided minority of voters. But there we are, and we find ourselves mixed up in this discussion, so it makes sense to add these pieces to the puzzle. Lux Alptraum, who yesterday we read as a way of reminding people that there's at least one major party player to all of this, whose views are not widely understood outside of that very community. That is to say, I think, North American diaspora Jews, people who maintain some relationship, antagonistic, close, some of both, with Israel, with Israeli citizens, very often family members who are Israeli citizens, who at the same time recognize the impropriety of the stance of many Israelis take toward Palestinians in general, and of course the outrages and horrors that have been visited upon Gaza since the October 7th outrages and horrors visited upon Israel, and what it means to have to enter into the discourse with people who have approached the issue in such a way that it leaves them with no possibility of interpreting what Zionism might mean to Jewish parties to the conversation, even those who recognize the human rights atrocities that have been visited upon Palestinians, not just now, but for years. And we read yesterday, just as a reminder, I think maybe it might be worth going back into the archived version of these things and reminding us of what it was that she had to say, if I can identify the correct one here. And this one isn't it. Let's see. Is it this one here? Yes. The assumption that Lux mentioned yesterday, the assumption that many leftists have, that anyone who IDs as a Zionist is automatically co-signing the most vile and abusive discrimination against Palestinians, is completely missing how Zionism functions as a part of diaspora Jewish identity, that many self-ID'd Zionists have not, and maybe they should, but they haven't, to this point, put deep thought into the logic and history of Zionism. They merely understand it as a love of and pride in Judaism. I know this because this is part of my own history. And when you tell these people no Zionists allowed, or you use the formulation as the one student did at Columbia University, and not just one student, but the student who led the initial press conferences from the student leadership of the encampment there, that no Zionists ought to be allowed to live, right? Well, when you tell these people no Zionists allowed, or that you're not allowed to live, then they do not hear it as a rejection of apartheid. They hear it as a rejection of Jews. And this is why so many is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism conversations are total non-starters. A good reminder that while there should be space to examine that, it will sometimes take some ground preparing work in order to have a conversation that would be fruitful on that subject. Lux likewise made another observation which I thought was worth sharing. The thing that's weird to me, she says, is that many of us understand how Americans can say, yes, I know the U.S. has a horrific history and has done atrocities, but I love it because of an abstract ideal that I associate with it, right? Lots of people say there are terrible things that the American government and the American people have participated in the past, and yet I stay and fight for the soul of America, or I would like to see America take a different direction. But I do acknowledge the various atrocities with which America has been associated. But yet they suddenly don't understand how one can have that relationship to Zionism, which is interesting, right? Yeah, I understand. Well, civil war, slavery, atomic weapons used against the Japanese, various, any number of things that you can point to that were either then or in hindsight embarrassments to the concept of America. And yet, I say we can redeem America and build a better future together. Is that not possible, though, somehow, when the country in question is Israel? And there are many who say it's just impossible because of the nature of the founding of Israel, although the nature of the founding of the United States is very much the same. So it's just interesting that you would add this. And when else, there's something else here that it goes on. Lux says, okay, the even funnier comparison here is that many leftists recognize that communism has turned out less than ideally every time it has been attempted, and yet they still ID as communist. It's not widespread, but it does happen. And yet if someone says, Israel did not work out well, but I still believe in the idea of a Jewish democratic state, then that person must love apartheid. Do we need small z Zionism in order to help clear up confusion? I don't know if that will help at all, but I think that's a helpful reminder that there are, at a minimum, that if you seek to persuade the very large community of relatively left-leaning American Jews to come into your camp, there is some preparatory work that needs to be done, some teaching that needs to happen at the teach-ins, as opposed to, say, putting up to have your press conference someone who has said, well, actually, you should all be murdered, and that would be a good thing. It's offensive to find out that you should be murdered. And it's a teaching moment when you could say, well, now, how would you feel if that were the case and people were saying it about you and that it was actually majority opinion just because you happened to be Palestinian and or Muslim, and therefore that was an acceptable view. Oh, well, there is a teaching moment in that. Teach it rather than condemning people to death. But then, well, how would you feel? Oh, of course they have, and I understand that there's reasons why they feel this way, but then there's also the rise above alternative as well. Is it difficult to do? Yes. Is it justifiable or is it explainable in terms of psychology to say, well, why would they feel this way? Yes. And do they need to, why then call upon them to make this sacrifice for your feelings? Well, I don't know. It's not necessary that they're certainly not obligated to do it, but it is a movement that places allegedly a fairly high value on martyrdom. But I guess only one kind of martyrdom. Well, they can hardly be blamed for that. That's, again, that too is the human condition. But if you're into martyrdom, then why not maybe another kind of sacrifice? Well, is it our job to sacrifice for you? No, your martyrs are for yourself. That's true. And no one can force you to think otherwise. But it might help at some point to reach a solution. I don't know. The other thing I wanted to enter onto the record is this rather lengthier offering from, although it's lengthy in one entry, although I guess the tweet thread from Lux is probably just about as long. Dov Waxman, a professor and relevant in this sense, a professor at UCLA at the moment. I'd be interested to check in with him at this point, given the events at UCLA in the last couple of days, and find out what he's thinking about this. Not just a professor at UCLA, but the Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies and director of the Y&S Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. And, well, I'd be interested now, and maybe perhaps you are too, in what they have to say. Dove has this: I am a scholar of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and longtime advocate for peace and for Palestinian rights. And I guess that's supposed to be the price of entry into this conversation. And it's viewed differently by lots of different people, right? Some will say, okay, good, I see this disclaimer as an opening for dialogue. Others will say, no, it's a trap. They've all learned the dirty trick of saying that they support Palestinian rights, but when it comes down to it, would they join us in attacking kibbutzim in the name of Hamas on October 7th? No, they wouldn't fight alongside us. They wanted to live. And that's evidence that they are not making the relevant. What? Okay. Extremist. Nut picking? You bet. Happens everywhere. But at the same time, keep in mind that the most vocal peace activists in Israel were the first murdered on October 7th. So if everybody gets to have a little bit of sensitivity around these issues, is that so wrong? All right. Well, here's what Dove, who wasn't there on October 7th, has to say. I'm a scholar of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, longtime advocate for peace and Palestinian rights. I have publicly opposed Israel's occupation of the West Bank as well, and its blockade and now destruction of Gaza. He seems to be saying the right things, right? I support the rights of students and faculty to peacefully protest against Israel, including by establishing protest encampments such as the one on my campus at UCLA. I do not want these protest camps to be removed by the police or outside agitators or vigilantes, presumably. whose propensity, the police's propensity for unnecessary and excessive use of force is well established. As a Jew, I do not personally feel threatened or unsafe because of the protest encampment at UCLA. I know some of the students taking part and believe they are well-intentioned. Many, probably most, of the protesters are simply horrified by the mass killing and near famine in Gaza and want it to end. And then you'll have people shouting, what do you mean near famine? All right. So do I. But I cannot join this protest because it is not just a protest against the war in Gaza. To no one's surprise, it might involve more than that, right? I would think. Among the demands of the protest organizers is the demand to, quote, sever all UC-wide connections to Israeli universities, including study abroad programs, fellowships, seminars, and research collaborations, and UCLA's Nazarian Center. Well, needless to say, I oppose the demand to boycott the Nazarian Center, which I direct. The center is devoted to the academic study of Israel and has no ties to the Israeli government. I also oppose boycotting Israeli academic institutions and academic boycotts in general. But it isn't only the demands of the protest organizers that I have a problem with. One of the organizations behind the protest, Students for Justice in Palestine, and they're behind most of the protests in most of the places, has expressed support for Hamas and has even celebrated the massacre of Israelis on October 7th. And then you might have people quibbling, well, celebrate. Well, in many cases, yes. And in many cases, no. But in many cases, yes. So if there's a yes on the table, don't you have to address it? Being in solidarity with Palestinians does not necessitate supporting Hamas, and by the way, does not imply supporting Hamas. But if you're explicit with it, you might want to have a teaching moment there, too, as well. On the contrary, Hamas oppresses Palestinians and has no concern for the lives of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. They have openly stated that they are willing to sacrifice countless Palestinian lives, martyrs, for their cause, which is, of course, the ultimate eradication of Israel. They have spent billions building a vast underground network to protect themselves and their weaponry, but they haven't built a single bomb shelter for Gazan civilians or sheltered them in their tunnels, which do exist. They are prolonging the devastating war in Gaza and the humanitarian crisis there in order to maintain their power and authoritarian rule in Gaza. As an aside, I will add to that also, by the way, very much the fault of Netanyahu himself, who has, for very cynical reasons, decided that it is actually wise or had been wise anyway, to support the continuation, economically and otherwise, of Hamas and its power in Gaza. Why? I think we've been over it, but to the extent that Hamas stands in opposition to the recognized Palestinian Authority that still controls the West Bank, then there will be no point in moving forward, even under pressure, for negotiations for a two-state solution or any number of states solution, because the Palestinians can't agree on who will represent them in these negotiations. That's the official position. Right? The Israelis say, we don't know who to talk to. The Palestinian Authority or Hamas? How about both? How about neither? I don't know. But this is the play that Netanyahu is making. They can't decide, so we don't have to do anything because they won't make up their minds. They won't make up their minds, of course, for various reasons, some good and some bad. But there they are. That's the play from the Netanyahu side. And where do we leave off in this statement here? They're prolonging the devastating war in Gaza. Hamas, that's certainly true. They're being supported in doing so by Netanyahu. That certainly seems to be true as well. And all of this in order to maintain their power and authoritarian rule in Gaza. I know that many people in the pro-Palestinian movement, he continues, don't support Hamas and don't praise the October 7th massacre. But Groups like SJP, he says, lead the movement on many college campuses, exploiting the sympathy that many students rightly feel for the suffering of Palestinians. And that, too, is a major sticking point, that the vast majority, I think, of students who are participating in and or are supportive of the demonstrations almost certainly say, well, they all agree that the violence there should end because people don't like violence very much. And they all agree that the human rights of Palestinians need to be protected and respected because they're humans, and the people who support them are humans, and golly, they have similar interests there. Stop the killing and enforce human rights there and everywhere. Yes, that's obvious, and I think ultimately at some point, hopefully in the near future, an attainable goal at that. That's the majority of their focus. Whether they look any deeper into what Students for Justice in Palestine says on their website, or supports in past white papers that they may or may not have easy access to, we have no idea. And we can well imagine that they might not support all of that. And they are there for their own reasons. But yeah, that's just the nature of mass protest, too, that the people who are organizing it and who have the microphones that they can set up and the press will come and listen to them speak about why they're at the protest, well, they happen to have this on their record. Groups like SJP lead the movements on many college campuses, exploiting the sympathy that many students rightly feel for the suffering of Palestinians. Students and faculty demonstrating in support of Palestinians shouldn't ignore the fact that the organizers of these demonstrations are, in many cases, ideologically committed to eradicating Israel and expelling Israeli Jews, and are supportive of violence against Israeli civilians, in fact, and willing to ignore or even justify Hamas's strategy of sacrificing Palestinian civilians for their political ends. I mean, that's out there, and it's true, and we're seeing it even today as we speak on social media, where people say, it's the Palestinian grievance is legitimate, and it is, and so therefore we don't accept the distraction of pointing out the tactics that they've used to express those grievances. Well, I don't know, man. 1,200 murders on a single day. That doesn't feel particularly progressive to wave that away. It's difficult. Maybe it's just only difficult for me, but I have a feeling ultimately it's difficult for many others as well. And if the purpose of these demonstrations is to highlight these areas that are uncomfortable to acknowledge, why not just stay uncomfortable and acknowledge that one too? But apparently it's not in the cards for a lot of people. I find that odd, to say the least. And then, of course, ultimately, if you want to carry these things through on the demands that are being made at various levels, it's awkward and uncomfortable. And why not force everybody to be awkward and uncomfortable in these situations, I guess? I don't know why anybody should get a pass, but if Palestine is liberated in the view of the Students for Justice in Palestine, and in fact established once again from the river to the sea, you now have a tremendous refugee problem on your hands, just like the one that moved you to these encampments in the first place, except it's a different group of people taking their turns as the refugees, and this time it's good because they were mean last time. But aren't there people among them who are less to blame? There are certainly people among them who will be more to blame, but aren't there less to blame as well among this number? What about the Palestinian rights and peace activists among the Israeli populace, who, by the way, as we mentioned earlier, were among the first to be killed on October 7th, but still some of them survive and would presumably be among the refugee population. Our occupation is good because the old one was so bad. Is that a progressive value? I never thought so. But interesting to note. along the way. Let's see. There's a question posed to Dove here. Can you link to some demands that are issued by UCLA's Palestine Solidarity Encampment? Where have they published the demands? And does anybody know? And apparently here they are on the Instagram account of UCLA's SJP chapter. Screen cap. Here it is. Our demands. 1. Divest. Of course, that has its own complications. Withdraw all UC-wide and UCLA foundation funds from companies and institutions that are complicit in the Israeli occupation. What does that mean? Not sure. Of course, the apartheid and genocide, which at this point is still a conclusion under debate, technically speaking, in the courts, in the international courts of justice, etc. The conclusion may be easily predictable, may not be, I don't know, but it is still up in the air. But yes, more to the point, rather than debate that, we could debate the more concrete question of what does it mean to divest and how could it be done. Second up, disclosure. Provide full transparency to all UC-wide and UCLA foundation assets, including investments, donations, and grants. Maybe more doable. Abolish policing. End the targeted repression and policing of pro-Palestinian advocacy on campus and sever all ties with the LAPD. I don't know that that's a doable thing either. End the silence. That certainly seems doable. Call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. That might not be doable. And an end to the occupation and genocide in Palestine. Well, end the silence. That I can do. End the occupation. I don't know that that's doable by the university. It's a great demand, but not one you're going to get out of the university. And then 5, boycott. Sever all UC-wide connections to Israeli universities, including study abroad programs, fellowships, seminars, and research collaborations, and UCLA's Nazarian Center. That one sounds a little less supportable than most of the others for the reasons Dove has laid out. So there you go. That is interesting. I don't even know. Some of the responses that are listed here, I'm having difficulty telling which ones are tongue-in-cheek and which are not. But anyway, I thought we would do well to enter all of that onto the record as well and have that in the background while we consider exactly what to do with the fact that demands are being made but not necessarily met on some campuses, but are being met and discussed on others. It would appear to me that they're probably making different kinds of demands, and when the demands are handed over by different people and are responded to by different people, you should not be surprised to find different conclusions being reached. Okay, so let's see. Last thing I wanted to squeeze in before we left is an observation made by one of our frequent listeners and correspondents, whose name I don't know that I have necessarily permission to share, but I think so, but I don't think they're hiding. But we'll just say our friend Roger here, and I guess if you were really into it, you could scrub back over our various broadcasts and see if we've ever mentioned his full name or not. But bringing up the point, Roger does, that the reporting from the Maddow blog, as well as Rachel Maddow's show just the other night, pointing out that the Washington State Republican Party has apparently resolved during their statewide convention, his letter tells me, that last weekend to eliminate the term democracy and replace it with republic. So in other words, like an official recognition of that stupid and relatively meaningless argument every time you say, well, that's democracy, or democracy demands that we all have the right to XYZ. And then the weird pedants say, well, we're a republic, not a democracy, which is really not an answer at all, but one of their favorite refrains. Well, I guess that's infected things at the Washington State Republican Party level, where they too have eliminated all references to democracy and replaced it with republic. But worse than that, I had seen this headline: that does point out among many problems with that, but from the Seattle Times, wherein Danny Westneat, do I have that pronunciation correct? I'm not sure, points out that the Washington GOP has now put it in writing that they're not that into democracy. And it means, more than you might think for... it's not just a rhetorical point about being a Republican, not a democracy. Political forecasters called it that the state Republican convention would feature turmoil, ending in endorsements of the most extreme candidates, all to match the party's current MAGA mood. That's true. But there was another strain to the proceedings last weekend that didn't get much attention. And this one's it. Political conventions are often colorful curiosities. This one, though, took a darker turn. The Republican base, it turns out, is now opposed to democracy. Their words, not mine, as you'll soon see, although we'll try and get as much of it in as possible. After the candidates left, the convention's delegates got down to crafting a party platform. Like at most GOP gatherings in the Donald Trump era, this one called for restrictions on voting. In Washington state, the delegates called for an end of all mail-in voting, which is amazing because Donald Trump is back on the mail-in voting bandwagon, as it turns out. Instead, we would have a one-day-only in-person election with photo IDs and paper ballots with no use of tabulating machines or digital scanners to count the ballots. All ballots would be counted by hand by Trappist monks. Okay, I made up the monk part. I did not have the part about banning the use of machines or to count votes. Did not make up that part. All in all, it would make voting less convenient and harder by rolling it back by at least half a century. But then the convention veered into more unexpected anti-democratic territory. A resolution called for ending the ability to vote for U.S. senators. Instead, senators would get appointed by state legislatures, as it generally worked 110 years ago, prior to the passage of the 17th Amendment in 1913. They're really all over the map on this one. We'll read more about it and discuss more about it later in the week. We still have Thursday and Friday to entertain you with, so we'll be back tomorrow. For now, Justice Putnam comes up next.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Hey, guess what? This developed yesterday, too. Trump's going to be free to make his way over to Barron's graduation after all. And Justice jokes that Trump should be expected to appeal Merchan's order allowing him to attend the graduation. Hey, that may come up yet. That, of course, and much more from around the country and around the world next. Stay tuned.